Hello and welcome to the Carlam Cymru revision session for English Literature. Today we're focusing on Unit 2 for the AS module and we're going to look at how to read a poem. So we're looking at the poetry section of the Unit 2 AS module. So my name is Miss Hales and I'll be presenting this today. Obviously we're recording this, so if you want to pause and attempt the questions as we go or try out the skills, then that's something that's open to you to do. I'm going to take you through the skills that you need to read and analyse a poem for Unit 2. And I'm going to be talking you through how to analyse the poem, the sort of techniques that you might want to look for and the ways to compare them. Because obviously part of Unit 2 is to compare the poems. By the end of today's lesson, you will be familiar with the skills that are required to approach and annotate a poem, and you'll be able to find the answers for the poetry response and how to structure that poetry response as well. So I think the first thing to do is have a think about what the paper looks like. It's something you should be relatively familiar with. You've done this when you've done your GCSEs, and this is the second unit, so you've already done one unit by the time you get to this paper. But this is the poetry post-1900 paper. So this is the one where you've studied two poets and you've looked in depth at the poetry that they've written. It is the second unit, and so far, if you're doing this course, you will have done the prose and the drama, which is Unit 1. There are resources available on Carlam Cymru for those as well. It's a 2-hour paper, but Section B is worth more than A, so spend your time wisely and make sure you balance your time for that. And the other tip I've got for you is to look carefully at the treatises. In Section A, you've given a named poem from each of the poets that you've studied, so find the one that you're most comfortable with. You're going to analyse one poem in A, and then you've got one question in B where you've got to compare the poets. However, you can't use the poem that you've already looked at in Section A. So you want to spend some time thinking about it and thinking about where you want to answer those poems, which ones you're most comfortable with and where you want to do them. Okay, so you've got to answer both Section A and B. You've got one poem to analyse in Section A, and you're going to write a comparison essay in Section B. You're going to need, obviously, lots of stationery, black pens, highlighters if they help you, but you're going to want to have lots of spares. A is going to be shorter than B. It isn't worth the same amount of marks. So quick summary, what is that paper all about? You've got two sections, both are on poets that you've already studied, so you are in control of this paper. You can get yourselves ready for this. In Section A, you're going to be given a poet with a named poem, and you choose the one that you're most familiar with from the two poets that you've studied. In Section B, you're going to compare the two poets that you've studied, and you're going to be looking at 4 poems in that section. In both sections, there's going to be an extended response. It's an essay, effectively. In Section B, you've got to compare, and obviously you're going to be writing more because it's worth more. So let's have a look at Section A to start off with. Section A is the named poet and the named poem. So you've got to have a clean copy of the poems that you've studied. So you're going to have another book with you without notes. So if we look at the Caroline Duffy example, this looks at a specific poem, reread Havisham on page 36, and then explore the ways in which Duffy portrays betrayal in this poem, and it's worth 40 marks. You know that you have studied that poet, you understand the context of that poet, you've got some sense of where they come from, and you will have chosen a poet and a poem that you are familiar with, that you will have studied. This isn't about unseen poetry. So you're looking at a poem that you've studied, that you are good at analysing. And you're given marks for that. So on this particular section of the poetry paper, you are only looking at 2 assessment objectives. AO1 is how you write. How well have you structured your points? How well have you incorporated quotes? How well have you linked your ideas together? So AO1 is all about your writing, and AO2 is about how well you analyse the poet and the technical terms that you use. So it's about you finding and analysing the way that the poet creates meaning. It is not about you simply technique spotting. They don't want you to just name techniques and say that the poet uses them. You've got to explain how and why they create effect. So I thought we'd have a look at Havisham and we deconstruct it a little bit more. If you're not doing Duffy, then this is still going to be something that is worthwhile for you. Look at the way that I'm pulling apart this poem and try and pull apart the poems that you've been doing in the same way. This part of this poetry exam is about you analysing language and how the poet creates meaning in some detail. So the way that I focus on Havisham here now is something that you can look at when you're doing your poems. Okay, so it doesn't matter if Havisham isn't one of your poems, just simply follow the same sort of style and techniques that we're going through now. Look at how I model how to analyse a poem. Okay, so the first thing I would always be doing when I'm looking at a poem is thinking about the context of that poem and is there anything I need to know. With this particular poem, Carol Ann Duffy has created a persona. So the narrator in this poem is not Carol Ann Duffy, it is somebody that she has created, that she has adapted and fictionalised. It happens to be a character from a novel by Dickens, who was jilted on her wedding day. And since that time, she has remained in her wedding dress. So in the novel, when Dickens writes about her, he describes her in her wedding dress and he describes the bitterness and the anger that she has. And so Duffy takes that persona and writes about her from the first person perspective. So I would, if I was doing this revision session now, I would be stopping here, I would be considering the poem, the question, and I would be trying to annotate it myself to start off with. So if you annotate the poem, you would be able to find out the sorts of details that you would cover. Then I can annotate the poem for you and you can see if you've got the similar sort of ideas. Okay. And one of the first things that I would be thinking about is, why does Duffy only call her by her surname? What does that suggest about her? Why isn't she Miss Havisham like she is in the novel? Why is it just Havisham? What does that suggest? One of the things I would also focus on is the sentence structure and how does Duffy use that to create the persona and show the bitterness, the anger that she feels. And I would also then be looking at the colour imagery to look at the sense of betrayal and the sense of anger. One of the things that I would also be considering is the choice of words, so the lexical set of violence that's been used to help develop the emotions. And then finally, the idea of the sound, the assonance or the alliteration or the onomatopoeia. How has Duffy used sound in her poem to help? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to examine this poem in a way that I would be using in an exam. I'm going to focus on the key words that I would be looking at and the key techniques that I would be talking about if I was writing an answer. Now obviously I've had more time than you will in an exam and I have done this in a lot of detail. You need to be selective. In the exam, you need to choose the most important details that are going to help you to analyse the way that that persona is presented and the emotions that are presented. So you're making sure you're answering the question, basically. You don't have to identify everything. I would spend a little bit of time annotating the poem before I started, looking for the key details that I want to use, and then I would be talking about them in my essay. So some of the things I would be looking at. I would be looking at the plosive alliteration. So I would be looking at how Duffy uses alliteration here to immediately set a tone of anger. Beloved sweetheart bastard. It just explodes out of your mouth. It shows you how angry she is. And also its end stopped. So there's a full stop there to draw attention to it. It's also an oxymoron. You've got the sweetheart bastard, which is obviously unexpected. And the expletive itself, the swear word itself, is unexpected because you've got this sense of a beloved sweetheart bastard. And then that is end stop, so it's emphasised to draw attention to it. There's no exclamation mark though, so although there is attention drawn to it, it kind of suggests that she's serious and maybe she's not angry anymore. She's been a long time ruminating on this marriage that didn't happen. She's had a long time to regret her choices. Perhaps she's no longer angry, but she is perhaps looking out for revenge now instead. The poem uses a lot of enjambment, which is the run-on lines. So the poem is almost narrative in its style, kind of like a stream of consciousness where she's talking about how she feels. There is some religious imagery in the poem, not a lot, but there are some occasional references, and this is one of them where she prayed for it. Obviously, again, we've got this sort of oxymoron because she's praying for revenge. She's praying for him to be dead. In the poem, she uses a lot of metaphors, and she suggests that she's got dark green pebbles for eyes. Obviously, the colour green is therefore significant, and we'd be looking at that to look at the emotion of jealousy. But equally, the idea that pebbles for eyes gives you that sense of cold, hard stare. She's angry, she's hurt, she feels like she's got no emotions left. She's shut down, she's pebble-like, she's stone-like. She wishes him dead, which is obviously quite dark. She's praying for him to be dead. And we've got the could. Ropes on the back of the hands I could strangle with. It's a modal verb, suggests her preferred method of revenge, but it also suggests that she's thinking about it, she's considering it. She hasn't done it. This isn't about her murder spree that she's been on, but she's considering it. Ropes on the back of the hands I could strangle with. And obviously the metaphor of the ropes on the back of their hands. I mean, I don't know if you've seen people's hands with the veins and the sort of muscular structure that stands out there. The older you get, the thinner your hands get. So obviously you've got that structure there. It suggests her age. It also suggests that she's spent a long time wringing her hands with the anger and with the nerves. So there's a lot going on there. So that's a really detailed analysis of that, and you wouldn't need to have that much. But you can see how I'm using the techniques to explore the way that that's being presented. I'm not just technique spotting. I'm not just identifying the technique. I'm looking at the effect that has and why Duffy's used that to create this persona. So let's have a look at verse 2 in the same sort of way. And the first thing you're going to notice is, again, a single word sentence. So we've got the word spinster, which stands out. It's how she's labelling herself. It's how society has labelled her. It's something that she's perhaps not happy about. So you've got that sense of that label there. She talks about stinking. I stink and remember. Is that literal? Is that a real sense that she smells because she's been in this wedding dress for a long time since she was jilted? Or is it the sort of metaphorical idea that she's something was wrong, she got dumped, there's a stink to the fact that she's been dumped and she's not sure why or what was the reason? So we've got the extended vowel sounds in the no, whole days in bed cawing no at the wall. So obviously that extended vowel sound suggests she's wailing, so that pain, that anger comes through there. The dress is trembling. So is the dress being personified? So is the dress scared that she's going to put it away? Or is she trembling in fear, which makes her dress tremble when she looks at the clothes of her past? The cawing no at the wall suggests a crow, so some dark, fairly gothic imagery, and you might want to look at that throughout the entire poem rather than just establishing it in one instance. Look at it, see if there's any links through the poem to the dark imagery. She talks about the mirror which she's slewed, so past tense of slay, to suggest that she's smashed it in anger, or it could also suggest that she's drunk, so that she's trying to drink to forget her past. This is an interesting one here. If you look this one up, it kind of looks at the idea of not knowing who she is. So she uses herself as a third person reference here. She's unable to identify herself. He, the person that's dumped her, has made her an object, and she's now trying to work out who she is. And so you've got that sense of her, myself, who did this. And you've got the idea of the dress turning yellow, which is aging. So the dress is no longer white, it's turning yellow with age. So it's been a long time since she's been dumped. Okay, so with this one, it continues something that was mentioned in verse 2. Who did this to me? A rhetorical question, but that sense that the story continues is again that sort of narrative thread of the story going through it. She doesn't know who's to blame. She talks about in the previous verse, me, myself, who did this to me. So she's unsure if it was her fault for him dumping her, and she's questioning her own role. Puce is that sort of really dark reddish purplish colour. Kind of suggests old blood. So when blood dries on a bandage and goes that really odd colour, that's what she's kind of referencing there. So representing old wounds to suggest that she's been hurt so much she's bled out from it. Puce curses that are sounds, not words. She can't articulate her feelings anymore. She can't talk about what's going on. So the fact that she talks about sounds, not words, means that she can't express her feelings. Some nights better, It's quite conversational, isn't it? It's almost like she's talking to us now. Puce curses, there are sounds, not words. Some nights better. So it's almost sounding like she's having a conversation with us. The lost body over me. So it's lost to her, but obviously there's also that sexual imagery there with the idea of it being over her. Maybe she's dreaming about him in her dreams. Maybe she's going back to the memories that she's got of him. You've also got then the sexual imagery with the fluent tongue in its mouth. However, she doesn't say he, she says it's. My fluent tongue in its mouth, in its ear. So in that way, she's trying to make him the object. She's trying to objectify the male character here by not referring to him as he. Obviously, the lovemaking is easy, it's poetic. She sees him, but she's trying to objectify him because she doesn't want to have that deeper, meaningful relationship with him. Suddenly I bite awake. The bite is quite a violent image there as well. So the act is sudden in the dream, the suddenness wakes her, and then the viciousness of the attack suggests that it's a violent, remembered incident. She's carried away by the dream, and then when she remembers, she bites away. So it's quite violent there as well. Okay, the next verse. So if you look again, it carries on from the last one. So you've got the carrying on from the last verse, and she says that she's got hate behind a white veil. So obviously the colours of white that you might want to talk about, the innocence, the drawing a veil over something, suggesting that she's hiding something, or obviously the white veil representing the wedding. So there's quite a lot of sort of symbolic connotations here that you could talk about in this poem. Balloon bursting, again, we've got the plosive alliteration. You've got the colour symbolism with red, which suggests anger and passion. It could also be the idea of embarrassment. And with that, you're suggesting that she's embarrassed by her dream. So you've got the veil hiding how she feels about in the sexual connotations of the previous points. Bang. Obviously, we've got the onomatopoeic sound there of the balloon bursting. It's a short sentence. It creates an effect in the middle to sort of represent the shock. Remember, she bit awake in the previous verse, so we've got that bang, which suggests how she's feeling about that at the moment. Then we've got more violent imagery coming through. She's stabbed at the wedding cake. So obviously you've got the literal and metaphorical anger to show how she feels about being dumped on her wedding day. And then she talks about give me a male corpse for a long, slow honeymoon. So you've got that deliberate link between stabbing at the wedding cake, creating the violence there, and then she's asking for a male corpse for the honeymoon. So you've got the sort of quite unpleasant references there to do with death and dead. She's also ordering you, she's almost ordering you, the reader, give me a male corpse. So, and the honeymoon is sort of talking about that long, painful death that she wants to give the male that's dumped her. And then we've got the plosive be here. Don't think it's only the heart that but breaks. So she's stuttering. She's finding it hard to express herself, as we've already talked about. She's got sounds, not words, coming through. But you've also got that sort of symbolic representation that this is breaking everything that she was wanting. So her entire life has broken around her, not just. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what I would be looking for when I looked at a poem. I'm an English teacher. I look at things in a lot more detail perhaps than you might, but that's fine. You've got to find the key specific features that you think help to show betrayal, and then that's what you're going to write about. You don't have to identify everything, and you definitely don't need to be identifying every single technique in that poem. You've got to talk about how the technique helps to show betrayal, and that is always going to be your focus there. So yeah, that just basically says what I just told you. So don't select everything. You select the key details, you explore it, and you look at how Duffy creates that betrayal. Okay, so you're being marked on AO1 and AO2. So what is it the examiner wants? And I recommend you looking at these assessment objectives so that you've got a real sense of what you're headed for, setting yourself targets as well, looking at the AOs and thinking, right, if this is what my teacher's saying I am at the moment, so say for example I'm getting band 3 responses, what do I need to do to move up to band 4? If I'm getting band 4, how do I move up to band 5? What is it my teacher needs me to do? So look at those assessment objectives. What you've got here is that band 3 is focused and it's clearly expressed and it's analysing points in detail, but you're talking about going up to band 4 by putting in a more secure understanding, up to band 5 becoming more perceptive and more fluent in the discussion of what you're looking at. For AO2, similarly, if you look at band 3 goes up from just sort of talking about how Duffy's used it to analysing it. And the band 4 and band 5, it says that increasing evidence of effective analysis. So in other words, you're getting better at analysing how Duffy's shown it. And you've got a much more critical awareness of how that meaning is created through the techniques and the language that Duffy has used. And it also gives you some suggestions there. So if you have tried this answer and you've written on the poem, those are some of the things that you might be looking for in order to get a mark. Okay, so what does the examiner suggest you do for this part of the paper? The examiner suggests that you spend 45 minutes on it. That's including the annotation time. So you need to annotate and write up in 45 minutes. One of the biggest things that the examiner was talking about with this paper was the lack of detail. People just rush through it. They don't spend enough time digging deep, and that's what you really need to be doing. Digging deep, really going underneath them. You need to be confident in analysing these poems. These are poems you should be really familiar with, so you should be able to really pick out quite a lot of detail quite quickly because you should be quite familiar with them. You need to really make sure it's clear and well written. So plan first. I always spend some time planning and proofread after. So don't just rush your answer through. Sit down, plan it. What quotes do you want to use? And then once you've finished, check over for some of the common errors that you sometimes make in your answers. One of the biggest things for this part of the paper, for the AO1 and the AO2, is the academic style. So a formal tone. You're not addressing the poets by their first names. It's not Carol, it's Duffy, because you don't know these people. So you've got to address them in a formal style and then focus on that sort of analysis of language in order to really hit that academic style to get those grades. One of the things the examiner was really clear on was they didn't want a stream of implicit readings. This makes me think that this suggests that. You need to be looking at the literary analysis and looking at the effect of the technique. So they've got to be really tied together. So your quotes are going to be crucial. Choose the right quotes, analyse what those quotes show you. Don't fall into technique spotting. That's something I've been saying all the way through. Make sure you look at the effect of the techniques on the reader and be selective. It's the quality of your analysis, not the quantity. It's not about trying to hit every single technique. It's about being really good at the techniques that you're analysing. Okay. And this is just another reminder, and it's something that's been common throughout this revision session. Don't just identify the term, make sure you comment on it. Don't just name the techniques, you've got to look at them. And so when you're using a technique, you're always thinking about how has the poet used it, why has the poet used it? Okay, so you're looking at how it affects the reader. So you've got a little example here, and it's something you'll have seen in the way that I annotated the poem. When I'm identifying the technique, I'm not just saying Duffy uses plosive alliteration, I'm using it as part of my point. So the plosive alliteration, the oxymoron in beloved bastard, perhaps indicate that the persona is bitter. I'm using the technical terminology in order to be able to make my point in order to get me into the analysis. I'm not just saying Duffy uses plosive alliteration, I'm showing how she uses it and why she uses it. If I'm really going for the top bands, tentative language can help to show an awareness of alternate meanings. So talking about this perhaps suggests, this could indicate, this may show that. So that sort of tentative language perhaps can be an indicator of alternative meaning. So it helps to show the examiner that you're not saying there's only one way to read the poem. Okay, so what I've got here is I've got a little bit of an example for you, just to show you what happens in the exam. Obviously, I've only taken selected bits from it, so I've got a couple of bits from the essay. And what the candidate has got here is really good focus on the poet's language with a link to the question. So if you look here, Miss Havisham has prayed several times for her lover's death. It emphasises that she's been consumed by the need for revenge due to the betrayal. So there's the key exam word, betrayal. They've talked about the poem, they've got a quote from it, and they've examined the effect. Duffy could be trying to convey that betrayal can lead to a person becoming unhinged or mad. So you've got the analysis of what is being presented. To do better, what could they have done? Perhaps could have looked at the religious connotations. They could have looked at the metaphor that's being presented in the dark green pebbles. So another little bit from the response. What you've got here is, again, can you see the repetition of the bee conveys her speech is breaking down, which emphasizes more that she is rotting away. So clear address on the poet's language, good link to the question again. This could be Duffy portraying how betrayal has an effect on people, especially women. This candidate got 12 and 12, which gave them a total of 24 out of 40, which is that sort of band 3 response. So you can see that there are things that they could have identified, things they could have done better, but obviously I've only given you a tiny taster of it. But you can see how this candidate is incorporating the linguistic analysis into their response. Okay, so there are two parts of the paper. Section A is the named poet, section B is the comparison. So because I looked at Duffy in section A, I'm going to look at the Duffy and Larkin comparison. Again, even if you don't study Duffy and Larkin, you can use this as a way of preparing for that exam by looking at the way that I approach it. So for this one, it's again open book. You have to do something which wasn't in section A. So say you did do Havisham and betrayal in section A, you can't use Havisham in section B. You have to choose different poems by Duffy. You will get some criteria, all right, so it does give you some success criteria. Look at them to structure your essay. All right, so it gives you bullet pointed tips. Look at how my meaning is shaped, demonstrate the significance and the influence of the context. We'll talk about that a lot now as we go through. Look at the connections and show different interpretations. That's really, really important that you consider those when you're writing your essay. The comparison is worth 30% of your marks. So of the marks available for this section, 30 of them come from this one thing, the connections between them, the comparison. It's worth the most, so really make sure you focus on that. The context is worth 20 marks. So when you're writing, you need to make sure that you hit more comparison marks and more context marks than the others. You need to make sure you really flag them up for the examiner, show that you're dealing with those. Okay, so you get 2 questions, you choose the one you want. You have to do the same poet in A and then into B. You've got to choose that pair of poets. You can't just choose a different set of poets because you fancy them. So you've got to look at Larkin and Duffy if you've answered on Duffy in section A. So you've got questions here which are asking you about your own opinion. You can agree or disagree. There is no right or wrong answer to this. Remember, this is the examiner trying to prompt you to have an opinion, to discuss something. You've got to look at a minimum of 4. You've got to look at 2 poems from the first poet, 2 poems from the second poet. You have to do 4. You cannot get a full mark if you only look at 2 of them, all right? You'll just lose marks. You just will lose 50% of your grade. Got you the mark scheme here for the essay answer. AO1 and AO2 are the same as they were in section A, so I didn't put that in again because it made it too small, you couldn't read it. So you've got AO3, AO4, AO5, and you can see here the difference in the marks available. AO4 is worth 30 marks. It is 3 times as important as the other AOs. Context is worth 20 marks. It's really important that you deal with those connections and that context. Okay, so there's a quick reminder of the mark allocation. So what you're going to do in this section, again, you're going to plan before you go. All right, so plan carefully, focus on how meaning is created, looking at the themes that you've been given. Make sure that your use of AO3, AO4 and AO5, so the context, the alternate readings and the comparison, help to enhance your reading of the poems. So again, it's not just about technique spotting, it's not just about dumping in the year that the poem was written or the year it was first published, it's about you analysing what that means in terms of the meaning. It's a really important point here about the AO3 is not to rely on biographical detail. It's no point you just reaming off everything you know about Duffy and Larkin's life. You've got to make sure that that is then looking at the influence. So how has the broader literary, cultural, social, historical and political context influenced the reading and how it was received by the audience? And obviously, you've got to really flag up those connections. This is similar to, this is different, this is dealt with in a similar way in the second poet by. You've got to make those links. Okay, so personally, I would be looking at that question and I would be trying to identify now some of the things that I wanted to do. And if you're not doing Larkin and Duffy, then you can find this detail, you can find these materials on the WJEC website for the poems that you've been studying. They're there under the mark schemes. This is the suggested content. This is the sort of thing the examiner would be looking for. So I've focused in on the human nature question, and I've got an example of it for you as well, so I can show you how a candidate's dealt with it. But what you've got here are some of the things that the examiner would be looking for you to be dealing with in your exam answer. So obviously have a go, see what you can get up with. Okay, so the previous slide was AO2. These are the context points. Can you note the difference in the way that they deal with those context points? They're talking about the experience that she has on the poetry scene, or they're talking about the influence of poets on him, such as Hardy. They're looking at the way in which those contextual points have influenced the writing and made a difference to the poets. Obviously, this is the AO3 mark. The AO4, the connections, what have they got in common? And that perhaps is somewhere to start when you're planning. What have the poets got in common with the question that you've been given? So starting to plan it out and think about it. And then AO5, this is a really good generic way of dealing with any AO5, which is the different interpretations. So you've got three ways that you can approach the interpretations. You could look at the ambiguities in the text. So in other words, is there more than one way to read the poem? So you can look at that and you can consider if there is another interpretation, if perhaps a different contextual point would have made you read it in a different way. You can look at a theory-based approach. So you could look at whether a feminist might approach it in a certain way or a Marxist might approach it in a certain way. So you can look at the sort of theoretical viewpoints. And the critical awareness is then the third way that you can do it. So the interpretations of particular critics, as part of your study, your teacher will have given you some critical viewpoints. You can use those in your exam to show that. However, you have got to engage with a view that's expressed in the question. The question will prompt you to discuss something. If you're engaged with that, you're engaging with one possible interpretation. If you then show that there's a different reading to that, you're then given an alternative reading, and that is the way to go about getting your grade for the AO5. Okay, so what we've got here is a little bit of an example from the same candidate as you've just seen for the poem. So the candidate does well with the context. So you've got, we know that Larkin was very skeptical of religion and would consider himself an atheist. This could explain why Larkin sees people who seek faith healings as being idiotic. So you've got that sense of context there. You can also see they're using AO5 here. Critic James Nearmore argued that Larkin had a more skeptical and critical view. So you've got a critical viewpoint coming in as well. What could they have done perhaps a little bit better? Maybe they could have analysed the language in the quote a little bit more, sort of shown the effect it would have had. But they do offer a named critic, and that's a good thing. They make a connection. In contrast to Larkin, Duffy still has a respect for a mother, which could symbolise human nature to be strengthened. So you've got the connection being drawn there. But they could have looked at the contextual differences. They could have looked at the differences in the way that they were brought up, their family expectations. And then finally, critic Joyce Ann stated that Duffy is trying to convey in her poetry how the patriarchy affects men and women. So they're actually making use of the critical view, not just saying that critic has got a point, but actually making use of that. And then this candidate had a mark of 6 out of 10, 6 out of 10, 10 out of 20, 11 out of 30, 5 out of 10. So they've done okay. If you go back to those marks, oh sorry, it's the AO3 is the context mark, isn't it? If you go back to the original marks, they haven't done so well on the double weighted one and the triple weighted one. So they've lost marks on AO3 and AO4. They haven't been strong enough. They haven't analysed in enough detail. They've still got a fairly decent mark, but again, it's a band 3. So there are definite things that they could have done to improve on that one. Okay, your teacher will have done these sorts of things with you. Ways to start points, ways to link ideas, ways to make comparisons. So there are some suggested ideas for you. They are useful if you struggle sometimes to think of them. One of the things I did in my exam many moons ago was I wrote down a whole bunch of comparison points, comparison phrases at the top of my exam paper, because I had a habit of using the same comparison phrase, and my teacher told me many times that I needed to use a variety. So when I got into the exam, I just wrote them all down on the front of my paper, just all the different comparison phrases that I wanted to try and use, and then I just used them as I went through. So to finish off essays, you've got a couple of different point phrases there to start to finish off a point. So as a result, therefore, in conclusion. I've also given you some suggested phrases for using tentative language, so which implies, could infer, may suggest, possibly demonstrating. So just ways that you can have a look at it and use them to support your responses. So what sort of structure do you need for one of these comparison essays? So you're going to need an intro. You're going to need an intro which basically addresses the question and basically looks at your opinions on it. Show what you think about it. You're trying in an introduction to give a snapshot idea of what you feel and what you think. Use some contextual ideas to frame it, maybe. So if you've got some contextual information that you think is relevant, then use that in your intro to show how your ideas are being shaped. Then there are different ways that you can approach it. This isn't the only way. This is the suggested way that I help my own pupils to do this. Personally, I find it easier to examine the poem from poet 1. So I look at the poem and then I draw the comparison to poem 2. So I look at Duffy, for example, and I'd analyse the poem that I've got from Duffy, and then I draw that comparison, making sure that I've got those connectives, making sure that I'm drawing in every point of comparison I can. And then I would do my second poem linked to the second poet. So I'd end up with 4 poems. I've done one by Duffy, one by Larkin, and then I've done one by Duffy, one by Larkin. So I've done it that way around. The other way you can do it is you can make comparison points all the way through. So you can go Duffy, Larkin, Duffy, Larkin, Duffy, Larkin, going through the first poems together at the same time, but making the connection. And then you can do the same thing again. So Duffy, Larkin, Duffy, Larkin, Duffy, Larkin, making the connections as you go. It's your preferred style. It doesn't really matter. There is no one right way, but you do need to make sure that those connections are really, really clear. When you get to the end, when you get to your conclusion, you're going to sum up what you think are the most important points in order to answer the question that you were given at the beginning. So you're making sure you're going back to that question, you're answering it, but you're summarising the things that you've said which point out your answer to that question. Remember that if an examiner is in 2 minds about what band they're going to give you after they've marked your essay and they're sort of havering between 2 grades, they're going to look at your intro and your conclusion to find out what you were thinking, to look at the way that you were shaping your ideas, and they'll use that intro and the conclusion to recap the key things that you've been saying. So it's well worth making them strong and good. Okay, so you've got 1 hour and 15 minutes on the essay, so you need to make sure you're planning and proofreading. You've got to do that in order to keep the quality of this up. Okay, so finally we're coming into some tips for the exam. You can control this exam to a certain extent because you can revise. You can look over the poems, you can look over your text, you can revise the context of the poets so that you've got those key details at your fingertips. You're going to give opinions, but you're going to support your views. So you're talking about what you think, but you've got to be analysing the language. So as you're going through, you're always looking at how meaning is created through the language that the poet has used. Please remember not to use the same poem twice. So you can't use the same poem in section A and section B. And you've got to look at 4 poems in section B. Revising for this exam is relatively straightforward. Do it. Look at all the past papers on the WJC site and actually do them under timed conditions. You might need in the first instance to give yourself a little bit of an extended time, so you've got a little bit longer, and then break it down. You don't even need to do the whole paper in one go, so you could do just a section A in 45 minutes. Maybe give yourself an hour the first time you do it and then cut it down next time. There are lots of ways that you can sort of structure that to revise that. Making sure in the exam you really balance your time. You mustn't spend longer on A than B. A lot of candidates find themselves stuck writing about section A, trying to write everything down they know about the poem, and then they don't get onto section B in time, and they basically penalise themselves. So making sure that you've got that real strict time limit, that you're going to move on to section B because that's worth more marks. And then obviously the one that I've really tried to hammer home today, don't technique spot. Make sure that you're looking at the effect of that technique. Okay, so let's have a look at how you can revise. I've given you a series of the questions and the way that they've done them, taking out the named poet and the poem. So this is for the section A, and you could plug into that any of the poems that you've been studying now. So if you've been studying a different poet, think about a poem from them which explores the night. Or think about a poem from them which explores a sense of place, okay? So I've given you a series of the different questions and you just plug in the poem and the poet and then you'll be able to explore that. And one of the ways to revise for literature, mind maps are good, plot lines are good, quote banks, practice essays are really good. It's well worth revising with somebody else, discussing your ideas, using any of the online revision tools. There's a lot there from Carol Cymru. There's also a lot there from the WJC. They've got talked through exams, they've got mind maps, they've got knowledge organisers, they've got past papers and mark schemes. There's a lot of materials out there. Really, really important to look at example answers, look at how somebody else has done it, but also look at what they didn't or did do in the exam to see where you can pick up marks. Maybe if you're studying poets, you might want to look at poet profiles. You definitely want to look at poetic terms. And I've given you there one of the tables that I give to some of mine, just to give you the overview sometimes. So this is just a simple overview table. Who's the poet? What's their life background details like? What are the key themes in their poems? What are the structures that they often use? Do they like named structures or do they use free verse? What do you find in their poems? How do they use rhyme? What sort of techniques do they like using? And the most memorable line. Obviously, you do that for one specific poem if you're talking about memorable line. Other revision tools, so this will be a comparison. How do Larkin and Duffy present experiences of loss in their poems? And then you've got the table there to look through, and you'd be thinking about quotes, analysis, and links. And then this is another way of comparing poems. You could then look at the 2 different poems that you've got, look at the narrative voice, the themes, the language and the poetic devices, the structure and layout, the poet's message. So different ways that you can revise and different tools that you can use to help you revise. And then this would be for a specific poem, going through and looking at different quotes from the poem, the narrative voice and the technique that is in, what themes it represents and why it was important. So I'm hoping that I've been able to give you some sense of the skills required to approach an annotated poem, and I'm hoping that you will be able to apply that understanding and write an answer now. Obviously, if you go on the Carol Cymru website, there are lots of other revision materials for you. I hope you found this useful through this session, and feel free to look for any others or send any questions in if there's something missing that you want to know about. Thank you. Goodbye.